DC Comics is usually envisioned with the big three in mind, a trio of superheroes synonymous with the company itself: Wonder Woman, Batman, and, of course, Superman. Behind any story, obviously, is its creator, and when it comes to the Man of Steel, that's creators with an emphasis on the S. It's a hefty story, this one, so let's strap in for the tale of how Superman came to be. If this is your first time with us, I've found that a lot of modern media is pretty impenetrable to newcomers. My goal is to provide a breakdown and guide to the DC universe in the order of creation, so it isn't quite as overwhelming. If you have a favorite character or story and it isn't in this video, it's likely to be found in either a previous one or a video coming later down the line. So to the newbies, welcome, and to the oldies, welcome back. Let's talk about DC Comics. Michael Segelovic arrived at the docks of New York in 1900, accompanied by his wife, Sora Keichels. The two had finally immigrated to America, having fled their motherland of Lithuania following concerns about the nation's ever-rising anti-Semitism. Once there, as was common practice, the two adopted Americanized names to fly under the radar a bit. Once Michael and Sora Segelovic, now they'd become Michael and Sarah Siegel. They settled into Cleveland and had 6 children, the last to arrive being our figure of focus, Jerry Siegel. When Jerry had turned 14, he and his expansive family had decided to move into Glenville, a predominantly Jewish neighborhood, and he was of course enrolled in the nearby high school. He was a quiet and shy lad, but made fast friends with an equally quiet and shy lad named Joe Shuster. If one had an idea, the other knew how to execute it, and it was all born from a shared love of science fiction, adventure stories, and movies. Around the time Jerry reached 16, he'd begun to write for the school's newspaper, the Glenville Torch, also adding his own little creation to the comics section, making a parody of Tarzan called Goober the Mighty. Enjoying what he was doing with the newspaper, Siegel also started writing his own fan magazine with Shuster, dubbed Science Fiction, the Advance Guard of Future Civilization. It was during this period, though, that the Siegel household was hit with its biggest tragedy. Jerry's father, Michael, was a tailor, owning his own clothing store, and one day in June of 1932, he attempted to stop a shoplifter. As a result of the physical confrontation, Michael Siegel suffered a heart attack and passed away. The Siegel family was left with some difficulty, and Jerry couldn't afford to put himself through college as he'd previously intended to do. Instead, he and Joe began to consider a proper career in science fiction and comics. It was during this period that they first thought up the idea of Superman, and actually went so far as to publish him in that fan magazine I mentioned, though granted their first draft was far from the Superman we eventually got 5 years later. This Superman was a villain, a psychic, and a megalomaniac. The word Superman was meant to be more intimidating than inspiring. So we move ahead to early 1935. Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster are still working away at their ideas, doing some writing, but not really experiencing any kind of satisfaction. But Jerry was still a big fan of the things I'd mentioned previous, so when he stepped by a newsstand that had New Fun number 1, he paid the dime and took a look through its pages. Of course, it was a pretty standard sort of thing for Jerry, definitely more for his own enjoyment than anything, but his interest was piqued with the ad listed on the final page. Sadly, we don't have that ad anymore, a micro piece of lost media, but it was an invitation to submit your own stories for future issues of the comic. Well, Siegel put a bunch of his own together, slapped a stamp on them, and into the mail they went. It actually worked, too. Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster were hired by National Allied Publications and got to work, starting with their first story about a ghost-busting detective named Dr. Occult. At this stage, the duo basically had their idea for Superman ironed out. They'd pitched it to countless publishers before without success, but figured that National Allied might be the right guys to go with. Then why didn't we get the Blue Boy Scout in 1935? Well, the main reason was that they felt that Superman wouldn't really gain any traction in a purely black and white magazine. He needed color. He needed to pop. So when Jack Leibowitz was working on Action Comics, a series that was guaranteed to be full color, opportunity finally came knocking. The snag, though, was with the rights to the characters. Harry Donenfeld and Jack Leibowitz knew what they were looking at when Superman was put on their desks, and they also knew how to get their money's worth from the hero. The conversation was simple, ultimately. It basically came down to this. NAP would pay the two of them a seemingly reasonable one-time paycheck, then the company would retain all rights to the character in perpetuity. Siegel and Shuster agreed, signed on the dotted line, and completely missed the line about never getting royalties while they pocketed a neat $130, which is only equal to about $2,800 in now times money. They got scammed, to put it in layman's terms, and they kind of figured that out after Superman sold about a bajillion copies and they had spent their $130 pretty much within the month. That being said, they were still allowed creative control over Superman as long as they kept working for the company and continued to get paid about on par with any other employee who hadn't just sold the coolest idea in the world for the same amount of money that it costs to get a new washer and dryer. Anywho, Jerry finds love, marries a woman named Bella Lifshitz in June of 1939, and the two have a son named Michael, after his late father. 2 years later, Siegel's mother passes away, another heart attack, and a further 2 years later, he's conscripted into the U.S. Army. Jerry didn't see any action, as far as we can determine. He started out as an airplane engine mechanic and quickly found himself as a military reporter, juggling a bunch of media positions at the same time, all while stationed in Honolulu. He even found the time to keep up to date on Superman in the comics during the time he was posted, which caused a bit of a stir after finding that the company decided to pull another fast one on him. Before he took his leave from the company, Siegel had pitched the idea of a Superman spin-off featuring a younger version of the hero during his growing phase. A Superboy, if you will. Nothing came of it, at least not right away, but Jerry, looking through another paperback issue of a character he made and wasn't seeing a penny from, noticed that Superboy was for sure being used in stories now. Jerry Siegel felt cheated. He got in contact with Joe Shuster, who also felt equally miffed, and they decided the best option would be to sue the pants off of the company for everything they could. Not getting too into the weeds about it, the duo left the courthouse with around $94,000 each, or around $1.45 million in today dollars. Obviously, DC didn't exactly want them back in the office after that point, so Jerry moved to New York in 1947 and got divorced about a year later. Also, I think it's important to say that thanks to the divorce paperwork, we have some insight into Siegel's actual takeaway from the lawsuit. After all the legal fees were paid, every T crossed and I dotted, Siegel only got around $29,000, which kinda sucks. I mean, that's equal to $447,000 now, but it's less than half of the actual settlement. So, divorced, Jerry pretty immediately remarried, this time to Joanne Carter, the woman who, up to that point, had modeled as Lois Lane for Joe Shuster to base his drawings on. March 1951, the two have a daughter named Laura, and 8 years later, Joanne convinces Jerry to give DC another chance. They give him a seat, but make it crystal clear that he's there just like everyone else. No special treatment, no exceptions, no rule bending. It goes smoothly enough, but by 1966, Siegel feels like winding up for another lawsuit, this time around hoping to get the full rights back for the Man of Steel from DC. They fire him in advance of the suit, he takes them to court, and comes out the other side with nothing to show for it. Obviously, no longer welcome back at DC Comics, he and the family move to California, and he works for a few other publishers here and there. Flash forward to 1975, and Jerry hears word that there's going to be a full theatrical Superman film. Seemingly having pockets filled with nothing but lint and a dead moth, he starts making a commotion about how financially destitute he is, and DC starts hucking $30,000 at him a year to shush. And he did shush. He went into retirement and basically only had one more difficulty: heart disease. It was something he struggled with for years, even getting a bypass surgery, but he still passed away from a heart attack at age 81. Now, Jerry Siegel was only one half of the Superman puzzle, so let's talk about the other one, Joe Shuster. Ida Katharsk was born in Kiev, and Julius Schusterowicz was born in Rotterdam. They, at some point, met and married, and immigrated to Canada. Again, common practice, they changed their surname to Schuster to fit in, and in 1914, Joe Shuster was born, amongst his brother Frank and sister Jean. Interestingly, like Jerry Siegel, Joe Shuster's father also owned a tailor shop. Around the age of 8 or so, Joe became a newspaper boy for the Toronto Daily Star and became an avid artist. His family was admittedly very poor and couldn't afford even the most simple of non-necessity items, so Joe would often travel from business to business, gathering any unused scrap paper he could to use for sketches and drawings, since they couldn't even afford their own sheets. Once he was 9 or 10 years old, his family packed up and made the move south to Cleveland, the city where he would come to meet his lifelong friend and business partner, Jerry Siegel. When the time came that Jerry discovered the ad placed in the back page of New Fun number 1, part of their submission was Joe's art. Again, the Schuster family wasn't doing particularly well financially, so those drawings were done on packing paper, of all things. But regardless of however that may have looked on the receiving end, National Allied welcomed the two aboard. Joe was happy to have the steady work, but most of his spare time was primarily spent still making tweaks to his and Jerry's Superman story. He decided on 3 big facets. Superman's alter ego would be Clark Kent, after actors Clark Gable and Kent Taylor. He'd work for a newspaper company called the Daily Star, named after Schuster's first employers, the Toronto Daily Star, and the city of Metropolis would be based on the very city he grew up in, Toronto, Ontario. And while Joe Shuster's art is honestly pretty recognizable, most of the characters were based and modeled on celebrities. For example, Superman himself resembled Douglas Fairbanks Sr. He also hired a model to base Lois Lane's design on, which just so happened to be Joanne Carter, the woman who would later go on to be Jerry Siegel's second wife. But despite everything that Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster did to tweak and edit and improve their comic, it was still a difficult thing to sell to, well, anyone, really. In fact, after a particularly rough rejection, Shuster, in a depressed rage, threw their entire pitch comic into a fire. After a few moments of watching his sketches burn, Joe snatched what he could from the flames, allegedly rescuing only the cover. We've already hit on the major points while chatting about Jerry Siegel, so you know how things went once Superman finally started seeing the light of day. After the lawsuit in 1946, Joe Shuster suddenly had a notoriously difficult time finding reliable work as an artist. He took a step into drawing erotic comics for underground companies, being very careful to avoid getting himself identified. Being the 40s, that sort of art was just straight up illegal. Nudging the timeline forward, Joe's become dirt poor, living with his mother to watch over her in her advanced age, and trying absolutely everything he can to avoid just becoming altogether homeless. Pop art, comic strips, one-man shows, whatever can pay the bills. But it still goes further downhill from there for Shuster. By his mid-70s, he had to give up art entirely due to his radically failing eyesight. So, with no other option, he became a delivery man. Embarrassment hit him, and it got worse still when he made a delivery one day, only to discover that it was at the new offices of DC Comics. After being recognized, the CEO met with him, gave him $100, and pitifully told him to just find another job. But he didn't, in fact, find one. Instead, Joe moved into a nursing home, having become almost entirely blind. After the fiasco with Jerry Siegel in 1975, Shuster was offered the same deal of $30,000 per year to avoid bad-mouthing the company. He agreed and managed to collect that money for 17 years before passing away from heart failure, still over $20,000 in debt. As a show of good faith, DC offered to pay the remaining debt to his estate, under the agreement that his heirs didn't attempt any further suits over the rights of the Man of Tomorrow. I don't even know how to conclude a story like this. Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster were two kids from Ohio who wanted to make something special, and really managed to do just that. Their creation has touched the hearts and minds of millions, if not billions, over the course of nearly a century. But when it came to what happened to them, after what Donenfeld and Leibowitz convinced them into, it was dark and sad, and it seemed like every day must have been built upon a needless struggle. Comics are a treat and can do so much good, but it can also be a front for backhanded business that genuinely leaves people out in the cold. But that's why we have to shine a light on the creators, the people behind the paper, because they deserve their time of recognition, of appreciation. So, thank you, Jerry, and thank you, Joe. And that's where we'll leave our story for now. If you liked the video, give it a like, and if you liked me, go ahead and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.